and welcome to yet another edition of the Language Access Lectern. This is a special edition of the Language Access Lectern for a couple reasons. One, it is our special education edition, and joining me today is Dr. Ashley Crown, and we're very excited to have her here today. Also, our very first podcast under our new brand, Piedmont Global, which is going to better encompass and encapsulate all the variety of ways that we serve multilingual families, whether that be in the education landscape, within healthcare, within state and local government, and really kind of encompasses the consultative approach that we take towards language access. Very excited to kick off this Language Access Lectern. Joining us today, Dr. Ashley Crown. Ashley, thank you for stepping to the lectern today.
Of course, thank you for having me.
Tell me a little bit about your role at District 70, a little bit about the work that you do specifically as it relates to special education and supporting multilingual families.
Sure. I formerly was a school psychologist in the district, but now working at the district level as a student services coordinator. So my job is to not only help with our special education needs across the district, but make sure all of our staff are provided the supports and the tools and things they need in order to successfully meet the needs of their students. And so one of my roles is to oversee our multilingual department and also working with our special education teams in tandem. One of my projects was to make sure we had accurate translation and interpretation systems for not only documentation, but also for communication with parents in meetings.
Well, I'm so happy, and I can attest that language access is a priority at District 70 schools. And with good reason. There's a lot of data out there that speaks to the role that parent engagement can have on driving student outcomes, student growth, social emotional learning, behavior in the classroom, just can have a tremendous impact on student success. Of course, regulatory and compliance needs remain a consideration. Of course, there is an evolution of those regulatory compliance, specifically as it relates to the enforcement of those, whether it be, shuttering the Department of Education or, some of the things that are going on within the Office of Civil Rights at the moment. Certainly a challenging time in terms of, being able to provide supports to our multilingual learners. Of course, over the summer, Title III funding was significantly delayed, which of course put a tremendous burden on school systems as they sought to, put together their budgets for the upcoming 25-26 school year. So language access is a foundation for success, but it is also an evolving student support that's available. And one of the things that I think is really important is to identify and understand that translation and interpretation services, they're not only for getting an understanding of, the information that's going to be presented in an IEP meeting or something along those lines, but it's also an important tool for driving credibility and trust, for driving parent engagement, and ultimately driving student outcomes. So Ashley, can you talk to us a little bit about the role that credibility and trust plays when supporting a multilingual family throughout the special education process?
Absolutely. And like you said, not even, at the table of the meeting, but there's so many steps that come before that. Just being able to connect with our families and have them feel that they can actually have a dialogue and conversation with us, whether that starts at the first identification of a student's need. Maybe it's they're behind in reading, and we want to talk to them about that and how we're going to support their student in that. For them to feel comfortable that they can speak to someone and understand how their child's needs are being met and be able to communicate back their concerns is really important. Not only academically, but this goes beyond that when we're talking about students, and you mentioned social and emotional well-being, it is really important that we acknowledge students' needs, not only academically, but socially and emotionally. And one of the subjects that's really sensitive to talk about are student social emotional well-being. So when we have the ability for an interpreter to help us reach out and communicate with the family about those sensitive subjects and sensitive needs of their child, it's really important so that they can trust that we're there to support them and that we can partner to make sure their child's supported in the right way.
What are the implications of gaining that trust? and gaining that credibility with that family? And what happens when you fail to do that?
Yeah, I think the implications are accessing the right support for their child. So if we're not able to initially create that first contact with them and make them comfortable in communicating back with us, often after that, if we don't start off right, there is no communication. And then so getting permission to provide supports to the student, or helping them access community supports, even there becomes a roadblock. And so not being able to go beyond that first communication is detrimental in the student's success, because we need to be able to provide them the things that we want to provide them, and we need the parents' partnership with that. So building the trust in our communication with them is quite literally the first step in getting students services and supports that they need in the school.
Well, that is definitely going to be a reoccurring theme throughout our discussion here today, Ashley. So we'll
Mhm.
continue to address that. But let's get into best practices for working with an interpreter a little bit. Of course, you've
Sure.
had some experience working with interpretation over your career to date. Of course, just recently, started working with Piedmont Global to support your families at District 70. So that's very exciting. We touched a little bit about the importance of building trust, clarity, and connection, and it was also the importance of family engagement and student outcomes. But talk to me a little bit about bottlenecks that could potentially exist as a result of confusion, within that process from the perspective of the family and from the perspective of the special education department in terms of the noise that exists and that barrier, as you put it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there are a lot of things that can be confusing in education. We use a lot of terms and jargon and acronyms for things, and in that, uh, the message that educators are trying to send sometimes can get lost if there's a language barrier. And without a language barrier, there has to be a lot of explaining of what all the different acronyms of education mean. But then when there's a language barrier, that's even more challenging. And when there's confusion in explaining to parents what level their student is achieving to, or what challenge they're coming up on, if uh, we can't explain that well to them and have them understand it, then they don't understand what we're doing to support their child. If they can't understand the root of the challenge that their student is having, we have a process in which we intervene students who have needs. So we have a response to intervention model. If we're doing an intervention with a student in the general education setting, and that intervention is not enough to help them grow, if there's miscommunication in those beginning stages, once it comes to the point of looking at evaluation and looking for a more specific area of disability that may need to be targeted, parents may be confused about why we're asking to evaluate and look for special education eligibility. So really having a way to communicate with them in so they can fully understand the process and be an active role in the process. They have informed consent and are able to be partnered with us instead of being told what's happening with their child.
So now we'll talk a little bit about the importance of setting our interpreters up for success. Of course, they're incredibly talented individuals, but interpretation is not an easy skill. It's a practice that is honed. Of course, having an understanding of that vernacular that's used in school systems is so important.
Mhm.
Especially when interpreting in a special education setting. But talk to me a little bit about the steps that you might take to prepare an interpreter ahead of time for a special education meeting.
Yeah, usually we talk about making sure they're aware of the topic of the meeting, what we're going to be discussing, what we're going to be reviewing, making sure they know the need of the parent. We've talked about where there's one parent who's stronger in English than the other, so how much interpretation needs to happen, and if there's anything sensitive that needs to be known that we're going to be discussing. Of course, we'd let them know that ahead of time as well. I think just even in we've had to call parents on the fly and not be able to schedule our interpretation ahead of time, but using an on-demand system, just calling and giving them a heads up of what the call is about. It's great for them to be prepared for that conversation. Hmm.
Next, we'll talk a little bit about specifically and how you might communicate with an interpreter. Of course, short, simple sentences works well for me in these discussions as well. Ashley, of course, as you know, I can be kind of simple sometimes, but it's important to pause. It's important to give, the interpreter and the family, time to reflect on, what they've heard, give them an opportunity to ask clarifying questions and things like that. It's also really important to avoid idioms, slang, any jargon that might translate well. I'll tell you a story. You might get a kick out of this, Ashley. So my first experience in the language space was with a Chinese translation agency. They're headquartered in Beijing. I got an opportunity to travel to China for some business meetings out there. It was, a great experience. I really enjoyed working with them. But I'm in this meeting with, a bunch of, C-level business folks from China, and we're going over our strategy for capturing new business in that year. And they wanted me, to take some trips out to the West Coast. They really wanted me to go in after the tech market, So I'm having this conversation. It's kind of an informal conversation. Hey, Mark, we want you to go and target Visa. Okay. Like, we want you to do business with Visa. Oh, yeah, I'm game. I'll play ball. I can get out to California a couple times a year. I can make that happen. And, I noticed that they started to get a little confused, right? And eventually my boss, stopped me the second time I used an idiom and said, Mark, this is not a game. We want you to go close this business. Like, we're not out here playing ball. Like, we're out here going to get this money. Like, are we going to go do this or not? So, that was a very humbling experience for me in the language space specifically. You think I'd probably know better. It was my first experience in the language space and one of my first meetings there. But I learned very quickly, just to be direct with people and speaking in those short, simple sentences, avoiding idioms is certainly something that can avoid, a little bit of embarrassment. It certainly was embarrassing for me in that circumstance. Of course, also, as we talk about, our interactions directly with the interpreter, we want to talk to the parent or the student. You don't want to be having a conversation with the interpreter. You want to make sure that that family can feel you making eye contact and making sure that you're really connecting with them. And of course, you want to speak in the first person. So I believe this. Once you've seen this data, you should feel that. You don't want to say Ashley Crown is now saying so and so, right?
Right,
You just
right.
want to have a
Yeah.
very natural, free-flowing conversation. Also, we want to be very respectful of that interpreter's time, right? Talk to me a little bit about, having that conversation with an interpreter present and that feeling of kind of sitting in silence, kind of waiting for that interpreter to do their role. And what has your experience been with that? I know for a lot of people, silence can be very uncomfortable, but,
Yeah.
talk to me about how important that specific aspect of the interpretation role is within your process.
I think this is something all our teams have had to get used to. And it's really important that in the moment it may feel a little uncomfortable or awkward, but in the end, what comes of it is a full, well-informed conversation. So making sure that you're checking in with the interpreter and that they have the information they need, that it is okay to move on, that the parents don't have additional questions, and to give them a minute to think about that is important too. Take away the interpreter part of it when we're sharing very detailed and very specific and very complicated and complex information about a student's ability and learning profile. Sometimes it takes a moment for that information to set in before you can think of the questions you might have about it. So beyond it having to interpret it, just having that conversation in your first language is enough that you need a pause. But then in addition, when somebody else is helping interpret that information, you've got to give it even more time. So I think it's just a best practice no matter what, whether interpretation is happening or not. We need to give time. We need to let parents take in the information that we're very used to talking about on a day to day, but they're not as used to hearing about. And so just remembering that, that again, in the moment, it may feel a little awkward or prolonged, but in the end, it's going to lead to better understanding by everybody around the table, which will result in better success for the student.
Is this something you train your teams on, Ashley?
Yeah, we do talk about it. And we have meetings as a department, the different different facets of different roles in special education. We have different meetings and we talk about how the flow of our meetings should go. And everybody has a little different role in the meeting and how they should play their role in the meeting and how to make sure to fully fulfill their role. And these are things we talk about all the time. And especially as we've been able to integrate some more of the on-demand interpretation, the video calls and that kind of thing, so important to have when there can't be a physical person in the room, to be able to learn how to appropriately navigate our technology and use that in a way so everybody's comfortable with it. We've had a lot of discussions surrounding that because it's a newer technology to education. Everything prior, to the past 5 years was in person. And so now that we have the ability to navigate in a different technology than we did before, we've been doing a lot of training and discussion about how to use that appropriately within a meeting.
As promised, I told you we would come back to the conversation around credibility and trust. And as a
Hmm.
reminder, as we're talking about, respecting the interpreter's role, of course, all of our interpreters are held to, professional standards, including adhering to FERPA guidelines. So, they're going to, maintain confidentiality and neutrality throughout the process. And I think this is a really important thing to remind families of as you go through this process, right? Especially when you start thinking about languages of lesser diffusion. So, for example, we do a lot of work in Spokane, Washington, of all places. We happen to have offices out there, and they have a large population from the Marshall Islands. So they speak Marshallese. And of course, this is a very close knit community, right? So when you're having a sensitive conversation around, an IEP meeting, for example, there's a possibility that that interpreter, might know that family or somebody,
Hmm.
affiliated with that family, or you can play what's the game, seven levels of
Seven
that.
degrees of separation. Yeah.
There
Yeah.
you go. Right. So that happens, especially in the world of interpretation, right?
Yeah.
So, you just continue to, just inform those families that, these interpreters, they're here to, you know, create this atmosphere and be a conduit to facilitate this conversation. But everything that you say during these meetings can be held, strictly confidential, and the
Yeah.
interpreter's there to support you. Of course, we talk a little bit about cultural awareness and sensitivity of that. So, talk to me a little bit about creating that culture at District 70.
Yeah, we have done a lot of work over the years. Our population is very one-sided, but we've grown in diversity over the years. And one of the things our district has strived to become more culturally sensitive and more culturally knowledgeable as our population has grown in diversity. We have actually a committee that puts together trainings for our staff. And this is, like I said, outside of special education, it's for our entire staff. And it's really helpful in being aware of the different cultural norms and how we present ourselves and, how that makes others feel. And so we've done a lot of training in that as a district. And I think it's just really important for anywhere and anyone, diversity or not, to be aware of how your body language and your words and your facial expressions impact how someone else is feeling, especially in the most sensitive of scenarios when we're speaking about someone's child. This is their child, you have to just be very aware of how everybody is feeling around the table when you're discussing that type of precious sensitive information.
It's so amazing that you guys are, kind of digging in and doing that work and responding to an evolving student demographic there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's awesome, Ashley. Great work. Next, let's talk a little bit about best practices for scheduling with an interpreter. Of course, as you mentioned, that has kind of evolved over the last 5 years, kind of
Mm-hmm.
pre and post COVID, as we've gone from more of a on-site, in-person demand for interpretation services to now video remote interpretation services certainly have incredible advantage. We can talk a little bit about
Mm-hmm.
that too, but talk to me a little bit about the scheduling process and kind of some of those things that you might want to avoid, or some of those best practices that you might want to include within your process for scheduling an interpreter.
Absolutely. I sat down with my ML team, my multilingual team, just last year, when we started working with Piedmont Global, and we came up with kind of like a cheat sheet, for lack of better terms, of how we can best make this process go well for us. So we talked about making sure we request an interpreter far enough in advance so that, they can be secured for the schedule and we can let parents know that we're good. We've got someone, this is our time and date. We try to also, if we're going to have several meetings with the need of an interpreter, we try to do that sometimes in one day, just so we can make sure to schedule those together. One of our important times is parent-teacher conferences, and those are really quick, 5 to 15 minute meetings with parents, but very important. It's a checkpoint that happens a couple times during the year with the classroom teacher and parents. And so when we schedule those, we make sure to have an interpreter for its evening times, and then we make sure to have them, back to back to back, to make use of the interpreter's time, and just for us to, be able to meet those parents' needs. We talk about make sure we have enough time. Don't underestimate how long you're going to be in a meeting, but do always have an extra 15 to 20 minutes in mind that it may take. And so we're never cut short on our meetings. There are last minute things that happen, but know our resources and how to get someone, if we can't get someone in person, how we can get someone on demand otherwise, if we need them.
That's awesome, Ashley. And you got into a little bit of our slide from the other day. We have this 50% rule that we put in place.
Yep.
So, everything that you say is going to be interpreted. Everything that family say is going to be interpreted. So, knowing that, it's so important to put an extra 50% on that meeting. So, Ashley, how long would you say a typical IEP is for an English speaking family?
Depending on the complexity, about an hour to an hour and a half.
Okay, so if it was an hour, you would need an hour and a half, and it was an hour and a half, you might do well to schedule a 2 hour and 15-minute meeting.
Yep. Yep.
We talked a little bit about this in a previous slide, but just the importance of prepping the interpreter like they are any other team member. Of course, you're in these IEP meetings, you have team members from a variety of different departments, based on their expertise. You're bringing these people into the conversation. You got to bring the interpreter in the same way, right? So we talked a little bit about this. We don't have to beat this horse to death here, but very important to consider those interpreters part of your team, if only for an hour or two. Something that was definitely a bigger challenge back when we were doing a lot more work on site is interpreter logistics and making sure that they're in proximity of your location. Of course, moving to more telephonic and video remote interpretation modalities has helped drive down costs. It has helped improve our fill rate, and truthfully, the fill rate across the organization. Sometimes when you have a contract interpreter and they're driving all over Chicagoland, things can happen, and I've heard everything from my car broke down to I have a medical emergency to any little thing. So getting interpreters to show up when and where, or I got stuck at a train, I'm gonna be 15 minutes late. Well, that meeting started, and those staff have meetings that are gonna kick off in an hour and 30 minutes. So we got to get that done. So very important to kind of understand what's the best modality for the moment. So telephonic interpretation, a great resource, a little less personal than video remote interpretation. So video remote interpretation would be an interpretation engagement that would be kind of facilitated like through a Microsoft Teams call or Zoom call like we're having right now. We also have American Sign Language available on demand for video remote interpreters. So being able to pull up an ASL interpreter on demand in real time, getting them on video conference in 30 seconds or less through a platform, great resource for school districts. So I think there's definitely an advantage to understanding or knowing the best modality for the moment, but then also understanding cost savings that exist as a result of that. So one of the nice things about the on-demand features, as Ashley, is there's no minimums for the on-demand calls. So think about that during parent-teacher conference when you start to think about how those minimums affect the budget and things like that. And then
absolutely. And I have to say, Mark, in school, everything's important in terms of time. It is always about essence of time. And like I said, we're caring for people's babies. And so sometimes we need to get information to a parent quickly. And for a principal to be able to use even the phone interpretation is wonderful because, we want to just call mom and dad really quick and we need an interpreter on the phone. That's a great resource for a 5-minute phone call. And it's, all these have their place in a different way, and it's choosing the right one for the type of communication that you need, but they're all wonderful types of resources in those moments.
So, we talk a little bit about using the right people for the job and kind of how this has evolved in the state of Illinois. Of course, Illinois is one of the most progressive states that are out there in terms of
Mhm.
special education laws around language access. So, of course, I'm very proud. I never thought I'd say that I'm proud of the legislators in Illinois around the work they were doing. I mean, we have so many governors who have found their way into jail. So it's not a topic that I'm used to celebrating here in Illinois. But I do think there's a lot of really wonderful legislation out there that could be used or referenced as best practices across the
Yep.
education vertical. So we can get into a little bit about that. But specifically, I want to talk a little bit about the use of qualified trained interpreters in Illinois and what that means. So, there's been obviously, across the entire country, an interpreter shortage. It could be a very, uh, you know, challenging place to work, challenging way to work, for a contract interpreter, I should be saying. But it's also very challenging for school systems, right? To be able to respond to, very diverse student populations. And oftentimes, especially for Spanish, um,
Mhm.
school staff would be relied upon. And, just because somebody speaks Spanish proficiently does not mean they're a qualified interpreter, doesn't mean they're trained in interpreter ethics, doesn't mean that
Right.
they have a great understanding of, the vernacular that goes on. So, if you grab the woman from the cafeteria who happens to speak Spanish and you bring her into a special education meeting just because she speaks Spanish, she could be doing that family a disservice because she lacks that experience,
Hmm.
both from the vernacular that's being used and also the interpreter ethics and FERPA and confidentiality requirements that exist throughout that. So you've been in the district, how long actually? It's been 13 years, 14
18
years, longer?
years.
18 years. My goodness,
18.
oh my goodness, time
Mhm.
flies when you're having so much
Oh,
fun.
yeah.
Awesome. So you have, and of course you've seen District 70 grow and evolve so much over the years. Talk to me about how you've implemented qualified interpreters within the school system and what that looks like and the importance of that.
Yeah, and as you said, there was a time where we didn't have a very accessible system like Piedmont Global, and we would use different staff and different, those that we had within district who did speak Spanish or another language. Doing that, it was what we were doing the best with what we had at the time, and we thought that was appropriate. And when it came down to it, having them not qualified and be able to understand there's very legal, an IEP is a very legal document. And to ensure that parents are fully informed, making sure that the person who's explaining that information to them needs to know the importance of that legal document and be able to speak to it and answer the right questions. And so pulling one of our staff members, who teaches Spanish down the hallway is not always going to be the best resource. At the time, maybe that's what we did because that's what we had. But when it comes down to it, having someone do something that's not their job and not their expertise takes away from other resources, teaching the class that they're supposed to be in at the moment. Or like you said, just more of a conflict of interest. Maybe they are also a parent in the community and it's a sensitive subject and they shouldn't necessarily be involved in that conversation with that other parent. It could make the other parent uncomfortable. It's better to have, a system which we can say we have interpreters who are trained, who can have this meeting with us with fidelity, with confidentiality, and to make sure the parent can feel comfortable that that is a trained professional whose job is to do this and understands that process and the legality of all of it.
Well, let's get into a few of these special education amendments and talk about them as best practices, of course.
Mhm.
Translating the 10 most common language spoken in Illinois for all vital
Mhm.
documents. In other states or, federally, I've seen, maybe 7 languages. I think it's nice that Illinois goes and extends himself as far as, 10 languages. I think that's
Yep.
wonderful. I think districts need to kind of think about, not only, translation into their 10 most common languages spoken across all of Illinois, but, maybe focusing on the 10 most common languages spoken within their district, I think would be another best practice
Yep.
that you could engage in. And then, of course, providing families with the translated IEP documents 7 days after the meeting as a best practice. And of course, we have all other documents need to be provided 30 days after that IEP meeting. And I think that's just important to kind of put these deadlines and these benchmarks in place so that school leaders know that, that they have a clock that they have to respond to. They have to address these in a timely manner. And it's going to give that family an opportunity to ask questions,
Yep.
engage with the district. We don't want a lot of lag between, that meeting and the opportunity to take action on those action items addressed within the meeting. So I think putting these best practices in place, is going to help those families, get access or, achieve the results that the special education department would want them to get into. Yeah, in Illinois, of course, you can request the translation of documents not on the vital document list. So I think that's another
Mhm.
wonderful example of things that we in Illinois are doing. And then, of course, similarly to qualified interpreters, there's an expectation for translators that they must also be competent and have gone through accreditation and certification. And of course, that ties into the conversation around special education documentation that might be coming out of IEP management software. So a lot of the school districts in Illinois are using Embrace IEP software management, and they have a machine
Mhm.
translation component. I believe it's powered by Google.
Yeah, it is.
So
It's Google Translate. Mhm.
yeah. So this is a very interesting topic for me, right? There is a requirement that these machine translated IEP documents are reviewed and post edited to ensure accuracy throughout that
Mhm.
process. And I think this is, for Spanish, I think that's something that could be, pretty easily addressed. But then for languages of lesser diffusion, I think it's hard in-house in district to be able to review and assess how accurate that translation came from Google Translate. And of course we have a myriad of tools, technologies, capabilities around machine translation. We offer machine translation with human post editing in over 100 different languages. So
Mhm.
we are all in on AI, on advancements to technology, specifically around machine translation. But as you mentioned, specifically within a school system, specifically where you don't have, or excuse me, where you have a very broad range of content with very specific content and all those
Mhm.
acronyms that we throw around in education like they're um, you know common language across the entire globe. It can be very, very challenging to get an accurate
Yep.
translation. And having processes in place like creating a glossary or a style guide for some of your top 10 most used
Yep.
languages, I think is a very important component for diverse school districts to consider. And creating these glossaries and style guides, if you're able, and I don't know if this is true, but if you're able to infuse that with a machine translation engine through Embrace or through other MT portals that exist out there, you can create guardrails around the translated content, right? So that when an
Mhm.
acronym comes up, you're accurately translating IEP. You're not going to come up with a different version that would not be approved by the district or that would not be well recognized by a family or things of that
Right.
nature. So I think it's a conversation that's going to continue to evolve over the years. I was excited to see that legislation introduced by lawmakers, but I think being able to hold districts accountable to that
Yep.
standard, I think, is really difficult, especially in light of everything that's going on across the country at the federal level, as well as the state. So that's an interesting conversation, and I think I'm a big fan of AI and machine translation. I'm not running from it. I'm not hiding from it, but I do think it's really important that we put appropriate guardrails in place to ensure that there is a level of quality that is reflective of that commitment that the district has for, delivering services and, supports to those families consistently, reliably, and with a great deal of accuracy.
I think it's a good point, and we train our staff. Part of that process is for the ones we use machine translation for. We always have the disclaimer that this was a machine translation, but if you are reading it and there are pieces that do not make sense, you have the right to request a further translation of that, and we can get, a human translation of that. So we do send our draft documents as the machine translation, but parents, we inform them if there's something on here that does not make sense, or if you want it further investigated translation wise, we can do that, and we have the ability to do that. Like you said, certain languages and machine translation are stronger than others, and so we make sure parents know their right to request more documentation or further translation.
That's awesome. And I'm sure it makes that family feel very respected throughout that process. I would imagine that most of those families are content with, receiving that machine translated content as long as, they get it in a timely manner and they have the ability to ask
Yep.
questions and those types of things. So I think it's a good fit.
Absolutely.
I think it's an interesting topic for, continued discussion. So parent participation. So this is, like when I think of like what the output of translation or specifically interpretation services are, I don't think of it as a tool for understanding. I think of it as a tool to drive parent engagement. And I think if more
Yeah.
districts thought of that as a tool to drive parent engagement, I think you would see, well, you'd see more usage of language services, but you would see also a tremendous uptick in parent participation, attendance at
Yeah.
parent teacher conferences for multilingual families is probably not at the same level of that as, English speaking families. So I think it's so important for schools to start thinking about using language services as a tool to drive engagement as opposed to just like hey, this is how we're going to figure out how we talk to each other, because there's so many ways that you can do that, right? I mean, you can use Google Translate and you can walk through a form together, or there's all these speech to text AI translation tools that are out there. You can get them on your phone. You can, buy apps. You can, there's so many different ways. But and I'll tell you a story really quickly, actually, before I let you go. So I'm working with one of the largest school systems in the country, one of the most diverse school systems in the country, and we're having this conversation around all the services we provide. So, we're doing on-site interpretation, we're doing video remote interpretation, we're doing translation, we're doing machine translation with human post editing. And I start asking questions about telephonic interpretation, over the phone interpretation, OPI, as we might call it. And, they said to me, what, Mark, don't really worry about that. We don't really use that. And we're talking like a school district with like 8,000 multilingual learners. And they just told me they don't use telephonic interpretation the way that, you described it as a best practice, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like make those 5-minute phone calls, let the principal connect with the family, do those types of things. And I
Yeah.
wasn't surprised by what they said, but I did want to kind of pick at it a little bit. I wanted to understand, how they're using the service, right? Like, okay, so you say you don't use it much. When you do use the service, how are you using it? What kind of calls you making home? Are we using the tool to promote positive student achievement, or are we using the tool just to report like behavior issues or disciplinary, um, issues that might occur? And this particular district in particular, they were only using that tool, kind of in a reactive fashion where they're making those phone
Mm-hmm.
calls home only when this kid's in trouble, only when, he's
Yeah.
getting put out of school for a fight or something like that, or, maybe he skipped school or something like that. But, you're going to have a hard time getting parents to show up to parent teacher conferences if the only interaction they have with the school is, Timmy punched Tommy and now we got an issue. Now we want
Right.
to talk to you. So, I just think there's a tremendous opportunity across, and I'm so glad that you guys are using the tools, effectively to take a proactive approach to language access, because too often I find that districts are taking a reactive approach to language access. And I think
Yeah.
that's because they're not thinking of these tools as a way to drive parent engagement. So, again, Ashley, kudos to you for all the great work that you're doing to support the ML student population. And hopefully, it's conversations like this that can kind of reshape the way that school leaders are thinking about optimizing the impact of language services within a K-12 setting, because there's a lot of different ways that we can go about understanding one another, but it is so important to create credibility and trust within that special education process and drive meaningful parent participation within the special education process. And I'm so grateful to have partners like you and District 70 that are choosing to take a proactive approach to language access. And it's just really refreshing when you see a district that really gets it. So
Yeah.
again, Ashley, thank you so much for your time. If you are looking for best practices for working out your language access initiatives, certainly, you can feel free to get in contact with me, but there's also great information on the Illinois State Board of Education website where you can take a look at all these amendments to their special education case law. So certainly, thank everybody for their time today. Again, Mark Byrne, language access consultant with Piedmont Global. And joining us today was Dr. Ashley Crown. Thank you for stepping into the lectern today, Ashley. That was wonderful.
Thanks for having me.